The uprisings against police brutality across U.S. cities came after police officers killed 46-year-old George Floyd. But the anger you see is also in response to a history of police violence, a history that has left Black people more scared about being a victim of police violence than being a victim of violent crime. Now, there are growing calls to defund or even abolish the police.
The relationship between African Americans and the police is a very tense one. To understand American policing today is really to tell a story that comes out of slavery in the United States.
Let's take a look at that history. From slave patrols to enabling lynchings, crushing protests, and shooting to kill.
My mental health suffers tremendously when my children are out and about.
There are stats to back up this fear. Black Americans are 2.5 times more likely than white Americans to die at the hands of police. Police use of force is the 6th leading cause of death for young Black men. Minneapolis police used 7 times more force against Black people than white people over the last 5 years. Such force includes kicks, neck holds, tasers, and takedowns.
In America, 3 Black men or more is deemed a threat. This is a problem.
Almost 80% of the Minneapolis police force is white, and that's far from unusual in the United States. On top of this, U.S. police forces have become increasingly militarized. Heavy-handed police tactics were used to suppress recent protests and enforce curfews. The 1033 program funnels excess military equipment into police forces at a fraction of the cost. Police forces around the country hold about $1.8 billion worth of military gear. But this brutality and militarization doesn't come out of nowhere. Dr. Keisha Blaine is a historian specializing in African American history.
The early roots of American policing begin within the context of slavery. Before the Civil War, African Americans, particularly those living in the U.S. South, were enslaved. One of the things that developed throughout various parts of the South was the creation of slave patrols.
Slave patrols were made of white volunteers. They would stop, question, and punish enslaved people caught without a permit to travel. They used vigilante tactics and terror to deter slave revolts. South Carolina set up the first slave patrol in 1704.
Well, the white volunteers who joined the slave patrols felt empowered to control the lives of Black people. And this is where we begin to talk about how whiteness functions within the historical lens.
Then came the Reconstruction era after the American Civil War. It's during this time the U.S. starts seeing organized and uniformed police officers. By the end of the 19th century, all major U.S. cities had police forces in place.
They are made up of predominantly white men, and they are functioning in a very similar way as the earlier slave patrols, in that they are continually targeting Black people.
The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the U.S. in 1865, yet Black codes were introduced immediately after. These laws controlled the lives of Black people, restricted Black people's movement, restricted Black property ownership, and punished African American men out of work under vagrancy laws.
Police forces were very much part of the story. Their job was to uphold these codes.
Jim Crow laws legalized racial segregation. Southern white supremacists systematically used lynching to terrorize African Americans. There were over 4,000 racial terror lynchings in at least 12 southern states from 1877 to 1950. White officials and police watched and rarely did anything.
By the time we get to the early 20th century, within the context of the Jim Crow South, what we see are police forces actually making it possible for white vigilantes to murder Black people, to lynch Black people, rather than arrest people for acts of violence.
The painful history of police brutality continued during the Civil Rights Movement.
There are all these moments where, as activists are marching peacefully, they encounter local police who attack them, who beat them up, who arrest them for all kinds of minor offenses, or actually no offenses. Police forces during the Civil Rights era generally stood against protesters.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation on paper, But uprisings triggered by acts of police brutality continued, from the urban uprising in the late 60s to the LA uprisings of 1992. Violent policing of African Americans persisted. Then, in 2014, a police officer fatally shot 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson. That galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement.
No peace! No peace! No peace!
I see so many parallels even to the 1960s, and not solely the ways that people are organizing and the kinds of strategies they're employing, but even to the issue of police violence.
There have been repeated attempts to reform police departments. There were calls for all cops to wear body cameras. They didn't deliver. Officers were trained to use more non-lethal force, but the training hasn't stopped killings. Thousands of cops have been investigated for misconduct. Police violence hasn't stopped. So people are recording police brutality, and people are sharing it. And in 2020, a white police officer in Minnesota will face criminal prosecution for the death of a black civilian.
I am happy that all the officers have been arrested. My fathers have not been killed like this. We deserve justice. That's all I have to say.
It's rare for cops to ever face trial, much less conviction. The officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck had worked as a police officer for almost 2 decades. This is despite being involved in a fatal shooting of a suspect and having multiple complaints filed against him. So protesters are calling to defund the police, and some are even calling for abolition. Campaigners want massive police budgets reduced and want funds reallocated towards social services.
The movement certainly brought the issue of police violence to the national spotlight. They will talk about how activists organize on the ground, and they will talk about some of the resistance that activists faced. They'll talk about the surveillance that activists face. I think the current moment is very much a part of the larger narrative of the Black freedom struggle.